Veterans History Project interview taking place in Tulsa, Oklahoma on August 22nd, 2008 with Edward Rawson Patterson, who served during World War II with the U.S. Air Force. Not only active duty through 1946, but also in the reserve and retired as a colonel. I'd like to start off the interview by asking you, what were you doing before the war?
Well, I was just got out of college. I'm a graduate of Dartmouth College, and while there, we all, if we were able-bodied, we registered for the draft. And I wasn't called until I graduated in '41, and I wasn't called until September of '42. And instead of being brought in as an enlisted man in the Army, I enlisted in the Air Force so that I wouldn't be in the Army. And that's basically it. And then I took basic training down at Fort Sill, and then I was sent to, now let me back up.
Certainly.
Before, all right, I was at Kelly, then I was transferred to Kelly Field, and while at Kelly I applied for Officer Candidate School, and I was very fortunate to be accepted early. I went down to Miami where the Air Force Officer Candidate School was, and then after I got my commission, I was up at Harvard University in the business school, statistical course, and incidentally the dean of the business school, brother, was president of Phillips Petroleum at that time. So we had a lot of camaraderie being an Okie, and he was an Okie, and lo and behold, when he came down here to visit his brother one time after the war, he stopped in Tulsa, and my wife and I took him out to supper before he went up to Bartlesville to meet his brother.
Oh, that's cool. That's pretty cool.
So we had a nice camaraderie.
Good.
I was sent from Harvard to San Francisco, which was the headquarters of the 4th Air Force. And the 4th Air Force covered, I would say, probably western, maybe 10 or 12 states, all up and down the West Coast and then the interior. And I was in the Statistical Control Unit there, and for about 2 or 3 months. And then an opening came down at March Field to be an adjutant of this fighter group. And I was just sent down there, and I hadn't had much experience being an adjutant. But anyway, I was accepted down there, and eventually I guess it was around first of the year of '43, we set sail for Africa, and that was a hair-raising experience because you could, in a troop ship, at night, troop ships were in the center of a convoy, and you had merchant ships on the outside of that, and then the Navy protectors. And often at night we could hear explosions as we approached the coast of Europe. We came into the Mediterranean, landed at Oran, North Africa, which was part of French Algeria, and went down to a place called Fleurs. It was just a place that was a big fighter strip, and for some facilities for caring for planes down there. We lived in tents, and the mess hall was out on the field, so to speak. And one day, while we were there, before we left, there were two Messerschmitts that came over the hill that we were in for protection, and the chow line was in existence. And would you believe it, we lost 9 guys in that strafing. And that was my first experience with war, or these German Messerschmitts. Our organization, the fighter group, was troop support, that we'd go out ahead of the troops that were moving from the west to the east to take over, meet Rommel, and they did. And so there was very little combat fighting among the fighter planes. It was all mostly troop support. The war ended, and we moved back. We moved to Tunis, which is a little point out on the African coast. It's close. I mean, it's a good departure point for Italy, and that's where we were scheduled to go to be a fighter base, at a fighter base in Italy. While we were waiting for transportation, because it took an aircraft carrier to take the planes, and that Tunis was that kind of a port where they could put the planes on the carrier. And these were P-40s that were headed to go there. We weren't loaded, but there was a catastrophe in the Mediterranean in which there was a fighter group that was headed to India. Their carrier was sunk, and a lot of disaster and battle things. That
was it sunk by a submarine? Do you know?
I think it was both aircraft carrier. I mean, airplanes and whatnot. All I know is that it was somewhere, maybe close to the Gibraltar. They'd just gotten into the Mediterranean, and anyway, the flight. I mean, well, their planes were the carrier was sunk that had the planes, and then there was a lot of disaster among the troops. So we were fully manned and ready to go. In fact, we were in winter uniforms at that time. And so we changed and got into our dear old khakis and got on a troop ship, British troop ship, went through the Red Sea, and came out at Calcutta. And Calcutta had some damage, and we were unable to land. We were out in the harbor. We were out there several days. We were allowed, at least the officers were allowed, to go into town to visit the bars. And anyway, on our return to come back from on the shore to the boat, ship, one of our men, this lady ran up and gave him a baby, and you know, the guy stood there and he took the baby so it wouldn't drop, and she took off. And then we had quite an ado getting rid of that baby to get back on the ship.
Wow.
But this guy's name was Paul Runkle, and we were good friends. And poor old Paul, we have visited here and back, and he's from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we often talked about that incident.
Wow.
Coming out of the bar. And I don't think that we were that well stinko by any means, because you just didn't do that. But anyway, Paul had a baby, and we got delayed. And so we took a train to Bombay, and it was a British troop train. There was just wide seats in the troop cars, and every so often you stopped and got out, and the mess hall would be out on the field, and you had your little well, whatever they call these things, that where you ate from. A little troop metal thing with a handle on it, and you just opened it up, and it was partitioned in there, and you put your silverware in it.
It's like a little mess kit.
Mess kit, yeah, you just ate out of that mess kit. And so we went to Bombay. That was a 5-day train ride. They weren't in any hurry. Anyway, there were wooden seats that we were on, and sleeping in a troop car. There wasn't any Pullman. And we got to Bombay. That was the headquarters for the 10th Air Force. And I had contact back and forth from our little base out at wherever it was outside of Bombay, and came into various offices within the 10th Air Force. And ran into some of my college friends in there. So, and then we went up to another base in the middle of India, on the east side, and well, the fighter planes really were in combat there. There wasn't any troops aboard. It was the real McCoy. There was offenses against the Japanese, and that's where I got my first lesson of you're losing your friends when some of these pilots didn't come home. And then we went up to a town that was just on the edge of the Hump, the Himalaya mountains. That was the Hump, and that was where the Burma Road was. And our fighter group participated with General Stilwell on the taking the Burma Road back from the Japanese. And I don't know, we had a feisty little colonel, and he and General Stilwell had a few words, and the colonel wasn't bashful about telling him what he thought to Colonel Chandler. So anyway, by mutual agreement of some kind, we were transferred up to China, and we were transferred to Chengdu, which was a big center for aircraft. And that was the beginning of the use of B-29s up there in the Chengdu area. And there were 10 different airfields in the Chengdu area, and we were stationed at A4, and about 7 or 8 miles out of Chengdu. And that's where these terrific earthquakes took place, was in this Sichuan province, where Chengdu was. There were a lot of Americans in Chengdu that had retreated from the coast and Midland, missionary type of people that came into Chengdu. We also moved forward to a place called Xi'an, and that's spelled H-S-I-A-N. And up there, we lived in tunnels underneath the field, because we were about 60 miles from the Yellow River Bend, and that's where the Japs were. And anyhow, this accommodation was probably an 8-foot sewer pipe, rain runoff sewer, and we slept in cots, and there weren't too many of us up there. But anyway, we had to put blocks underneath the cots so that they'd be level in this rounded area. And the showers were outside. We used rice paddy water for the showers, and it was colder than a bear's ass up there. And so we got away from that and would go into town to Xi'an, and here these huge pools, swimming pools were, and this is where the Chinese did their washing, baths, and so it just didn't bother you. You just took off your clothes and jumped in there and put soap on you and got back out. And we would have boiled water, and it had it was in a bucket, and then there was a milk can underneath a little one of these milk cans that, where canned milk came from, and with some holes in it, and there was a rubber stopper over the can, and you just pull on that lever, and that'd open up the water, and you rinse off all that water that got in that pool. But you would see families in that pools. It's just unbelievable. And Xi'an was an old city, and we went back there in 88, and I couldn't find anything that I remembered in there except the museum where they had found or dug up all these statues that had been buried for years. And here they were in this museum, and that was completely new. But Xi'an was a lot more modern than Chengdu was. But, and of course they had these terrific Chinese structures at both places, and the roof came down, and then they'd curl up at the ends, and the reason for that was to get the evil spirits that came in and have them go back up into the sky, so they didn't come down on the ground. Well, we had experiences up there. One of them that was most notable was that one day, a beautiful day, and we were standing around and having what was radar then. We watched what was coming from the east so that we would be prepared to go out and meet the Japs, and you didn't have a heck of a lot of time just being 60 miles from there. And so one day this call came in, and the guy was up, the plane was from the north, and it turned out that this was General Patrick Hurley that had been up north, and where the communist headquarters were. Mao Tse-tung was the general up there, and Hurley had gone up to visit him and see if we couldn't get them to fight the Japs instead of the nationalists. And the nationalists were headed by Chiang Kai-shek. And so anyway, this plane came in and asked for a fighter escort. He was going back to Chongqing. And old Colonel Chandler told him, and we got you on radar. There's no need of sending any planes up because it had taken gas. And this conversation went back and forth, and finally the plane landed, and these doors opened up, and they wheel up a truck to it to unload it. And here where this two-star general was in this opening. And so, who the heck is that guy? And so anyway, this general bellered out, says, I want to talk to the CO here. And old Chandler, he was probably 5'7" or 8", about like my size, said, I'm the CO here. And he gets up in that truck bed, a big old flat bed with stakes on it. He got up there, and this general punched him on the chest with his finger and said, I want a fighter escort. And old Chandler told him, well, hell, we can keep track of you. You're going south. You're not in the mainstream of the Japs. And he said, I want a fighter escort. So we gave him 2 planes and flew him down to Chongqing. And in the meantime, Chandler was griping to the general about how gas had to be imported up here, and it took 2 or 3 flights to bring the gas in. You have 1 flight in the fighter plane. So anyhow, our boys went down there, and then about 2 or 3 months later, we got one of these small editions of the Time magazine, and in the main article was that General Patrick J. Hurley had made an agreement with Mao Tse-tung and Chiang Kai-shek that they would fight the Japs instead of each other. So that was a turnaround.
Pretty historic.
That really, I would say, shortened the war quite a bit, because the Japs were really determined to take over China. And we were pretty well into China, being up where we were. So, but that Yellow River Bend, it was a historical place for the fighting in China. And that Yellow River is now being dammed up to have one of the biggest lakes, man-made lakes in the world. And they're losing a lot of their good production ground to this big lake. It's going to come through. Well, it's well on its way. And I can't think of the name of the town. We visited over there after the war to see this dam being constructed, and the place that had been there. I had been there after the war, I'll put it that way, when we were getting ready to go home, because that was a place where we landed one night to spend the evening on our way to Shanghai. I stayed there till the end of the war because I didn't want to go back over that hump.
Yeah.
And one of the jobs, one day an inspector came up from the 14th Air Force, and since I was the adjutant, why, he'd have to deal with me because I would have to show him records and so forth and so on that we were keeping and this and that. Well, it turned out that the guy was a Yale graduate at Yale, and he slept in our tent. There were only 4 of us in a tent. We had had a Catholic priest in there beforehand, and that's a whole new story too. But anyway, this guy's name was Wes Watkins, and so we got to be pretty friendly during this inspection. And he said, well, you went to Harvard and went to statistical school, and you're not using any of the training there. I said, well, Wes, we're keeping all these records here. And he said, well, he says, I don't think we ought to have an SCU guy, Statistical Control Unit guy, and this, and being an adjutant, you belong down to Kunming, where the 14th Air Force headquarters was. And so next thing I knew, I was transferred to Kunming. And these guys around there all snorted well, and look at that Ivy League guys taking care of other people.
Yeah.
And so I got down there with this statistical control unit, and my job was keeping track of the tonnage that was flown over the hump, where it went, and to whom it went. And I got into a lot of good meetings, planning meetings there, because I had to keep records of what had come and what was used and how much we needed and so forth. So I was the traffic director for the Hump products that came over and where they went. And so I would know, but sitting in those meetings, where the next offensive attack was going to take place, because that was the only way of getting goods into China was over the Hump in these C-47s, 46s, 54s, you name it. It was quite an operation bringing things in up there. And these guys would have real ambitious plans of we're going to do this and do that. And so I say, you only got so many planes, you only got so many tons that can come over unless we keep adding to the fleet. Well, flying over the Hump was a disaster because you went up, I would say around 18,000 feet to clear a lot of spaces. And that was one reason why they wanted to get that Burma Road opened up so they could get truck transportation up into China. And that was over in a lower elevation part of India, China, and Burma. And so that was another project down there, keeping that going. And you had to fly supplies into Stillwell. He was a ground man. And I mean to tell you that those boys were on their feet. They wasn't riding tanks and things like that. They did have a truck to ride around in for moving forward and bringing supplies up and things like that. So that was an essential part of getting the road open and stopping all the plane traffic that came over the Hump to fly there. So you had to bring gas on the plane to fly up and go back. And you'd have these tanks, barrels in there for the oil. And that was about, I would say, a good 60% or 70% of what came over the Hump was these gas planes. One of the experiences I had was up at the Chengdu area, and I was at this A4 base, and it was necessary to go down to A1, that was where the headquarters were, for this operation, and find out what was going to happen up at our end, what we needed up there for those fighter planes. And we had these old Chinese guys out there guarding the planes, and it was pitiful. But anyway, while I was down there, and again it was with Paul Runkle, we had gone down. Paul was our supply lieutenant, and so it was a matter of getting things, records, etc., what we were going to need. And while we were there, a plane crashed, and we were right there by the runway, and it, boy, just burst into fire. And here was this guy hanging by his foot out of the pilot's window. He didn't make it.
Jeez.
So Paul and I drove over with this Jeep that we had and stood up there and lifted this guy out and brought him down. And we hadn't, probably 50 feet or so away, that damn plane exploded. And boy, you talk about getting blown around there. We didn't get blown out of the Jeep, but we sure came close to it. And we had this poor flight man. And anyway, we took him to what was the medical center in another tent.
Yeah.
And so Paul and I, as a result of that, got the Soldier's Medal.
Okay.
Then I had another experience. I was flying one of these planes to a base, because we were scattered, having 10 bases there. You couldn't all be at one place. I was on a C-46, and we were landing, and we didn't make it. And that plane grounded, and I don't know what happened, but the next thing I know, I was hit out the window, or out the door. And I was damn lucky. There were 3 of us, and when that plane hit, we were standing up. There wasn't any place to get tied down. You did have one of these gadgets to protect you in case you had to bail out.
Okay.
But that door was open. We all went out and landed in a rice paddy. And if we hadn't landed in that dadgum rice paddy, I wouldn't be here talking to you today.
So you crashed, the plane crashed, and you fell out of the plane in a rice paddy.
It made a jerk, and the door being open, we were ready to unload. All 3 of us were standing in that area, and bang, we went right out the door.
It's incredible.
But we had lots of experiences of Japs coming over, bombing. When I was down at Chengdu, one night, a Jap bomber came in there, or maybe several, and I was in this tent, and it was warm, and the sides were up, and I was living in a tent that was at the end of the line, and boy, all of a sudden we heard that boom, 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 boom. We looked out there, and you could see those explosions of those bombs, and they must have been about 100 yards from us. And boy, just lying there in bed and seeing all those flashes out like that, we experienced a lot of bombings from Japs. And they weren't supposed to have happened because they had this network over there, and unfortunately, the network were men that were running up and telling somebody, and then they'd tell somebody, so it was a human network, and oftentimes we didn't get the word. So we did have a few experiences like that. But for the most part, we would know when planes took off over in the Japanese section. They were after these B-29s, and I can't think of the general that commanded the B-29. He became the Chief of Staff of the Air Force.
Is it LeMay?
Huh?
Is it LeMay?
Yes.
Okay.
How do you do it? Well, yeah, it was General LeMay. He was a one-star general at that time, and they had these 29s up there. And, you know, I don't know how many flights over the hump they took. And then having the fighter planes, our fighter, P-40, could only go about 700 miles. So, and they would go over to the tail end of the Japanese islands. And that was as far as they could go at that time. This was before they were using the planes out of these islands in the Pacific. But anyway, they decided, LeMay and whoever else was in the thing, decided that it was useless to use those 29s to go over there to Japan. The Japs cremated a lot of those guys, you know. And, you know, that was one of the pitiful things about, you'd have a good friend that was a fighter pilot, and they were a different group, you know. Quite individualistic. They didn't mind telling the colonel to go to hell. and instead of putting putting them in a tank someplace,
Yeah.
they'd have a big old argument.
Yeah.
And finally, I remember Colonel Chandler saying, "Now, fellas, this is what we're going to do. Keep your damn mouth shut. We're not." I don't know whatever happened to him when I moved from Chengdu down to Kunming. I lost contact with a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
Well, we still had reunions, but after we started having families, why, the reunions petered out.
Yeah. They were distracting you.
So I feel very fortunate to come home.
And where were you when the atom bomb was dropped?
I was in China.
Yeah. How did you hear about it?
Well, I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, heck yes. Through intelligence, we knew or found that they were working on a bomb that would excel any kind of bomb that we were presently using. And we didn't know it was nuclear or anything like that, but the rumor mill was out that there was soon to be a bomb, or bombs, that would be very devastating when they were used. We got an inkling of that from when the B-29s were down at A1, that there was something in the mill.
Mm.
And it was just a rumor, you know, but anyway, that. But anyway, when they declared the end of the war, I was in Kunming, and so instead of going back over the hump, I elected to stay around. And
so you're really concerned about flying over the hump. Was it because you knew how many accidents occurred because of your position?
Well, yeah, keeping statistics.
Yeah. So you looked and you thought, okay, I don't think I'm going to go that way.
Well, you know, you'd run into weather. It was unbelievable weather. Well, the rule was that when you got to 10,000 feet, you put on your oxygen mask. That was standard. And hell, you'd have that mask on there for, I don't know, a couple hours or so before you got over the hump. Being in this hump allocation office, I had to go down in India and talk to certain people about getting things up there. And, well, you got enough supply, you got this and that. And then I'd report back into these staff meetings. And so you sure knew what was going to happen. But boy, I'll tell you, if you didn't have a good day, there wasn't any way of knowing where the heck you were. When there's all clouds, you were just in a whole bank of clouds. And so the dear old pilot up there said, well, they were experienced, a lot of them. Well, I'm going to fly this direction for this length of time, and I'm going to do something else so that you'd miss the mountains.
And you didn't want any part of that?
No, I sure did. Well, I read in the paper where one of my good friends that was one of the Hump pilots passed away the other day, Townsend Wilson. And his folks used to belong here to First Press. But
so how did you leave? How did you leave China then? Did you go to the East Coast?
I flew out.
You flew out?
Yeah.
Where'd you fly to from?
We flew to Shanghai.
Okay, so you went east then.
I went east, yeah.
Okay.
And it was just that was an interesting experience coming into Shanghai. American troops had already got in there, but there hadn't been anybody from the 14th Air Force. And I had this friend finally went back to college, Bob Smith, Major Smith. Anyway, visiting with these pilots because they'd been back and forth, he told us about the hotels that were in Shanghai and where the Bund was. And that was like Michigan Avenue in Chicago.
Oh, really?
Big, beautiful set of nice hotels and things like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, we got into Shanghai, and we had 2 Jeeps. They had only 2 Jeeps, only Jeeps that and so and we had some enlisted men, and we gave them 1 Jeep, we took the other. And found our way downtown. And we stayed in a hotel called Broadway Mansions. It was the end of the Bund. And across the corner from us was the Russian embassy. Ah. But it was a beautiful expanse to look down that strip. And anyway, we were driving around. There were 4 of us. And we saw this Broadway mansion. And so we went in there, and it was a hotel where the Japs were holed up. Mm. And behind it was a big garage where they'd kept their cars. And boy, old Smith, he got hold of this guy that was the desk manager, told him he wanted all those Japs out of there. And they were marrying him. By God, to get them out of here. And he said, I'm going to give you so many minutes. And I said, Bob.
It's just us.
Well, anyway, they got him out of there. And they went over to that garage, taking suitcases. Kind of funny.
So you just ran them off.
We ran them off. And anyway, we each got a corner room. And so I guess it was the next night, we went down the Bund and went to this nice hotel. And here were some Americans in there, civilians. And one of the guys was the editor of Time magazine.
Really?
Yeah. Damn. Anyway, he sat at this long table we were at, and he'd just gotten there. Mm. And he was over there to find out how they're going to settle this war. And he was there with some other people, and we had several State Department people that were with him. Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, he hadn't really gotten his feet on the ground, so we told him, well, you'd come down to Broadway Mansion. Now, that hotel was bigger than the Mayo Hotel. Oh, what was his name? Well, his wife became a congressman.
Really?
Yeah. Well, anyway, we had several enjoyable meals with him and these other guys. And I'll say this, that we just had a heck of a lot of respect for what he was doing and what he would say and so forth. Mm-hmm. But that meal at that hotel, we had a drink or 2 to start with, and then the last thing was Eskimo dessert. Mm. And the whole dang thing only cost 70 cents.
So it was a good place to stay.
It was a British hotel to start with.
Yeah.
And but anyway, we got him to move down to Broadway Mansion.
Well, you made room for him. Oh. You ran off all the... Were they like Japanese officers that were staying there, or Japanese businessmen, or what?
Civilians, whatnot.
So they just said, get out of here. Was there still a lot of Japanese soldiers milling around China waiting to go home, or?
Well, there were a lot. There was a number in Shanghai, mm-hmm. And our group, that is the Americans there, they got them out of there. Mm. Anybody that was a Jap, he either went back to Japan or into China somewhere.
Yeah.
No, they didn't fool around with them.
Okay.
That Army group was, they were a tough bunch of people.
How did the average Chinese citizen treat you guys while you were there?
Oh, I'd say very well.
Yeah.
We ran into a Chinese later on in the war at this base, A4. There was a Chinese individual. Well, the Chinese we were guests of the Chinese because they had to feed us and put us up. And he had gone to school, and I don't recall the school, but it wasn't very well known. But he had been a student there until before the war.
Okay.
And when the war came out, or I'm talking about Pearl Harbor.
Got it.
And up in Dartmouth, there were several Japanese students and Chinese. And boy, when Pearl Harbor came, you didn't see them anymore.
You're gone.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It just disappeared.
Yeah.
But the average Chinese, well, of course, they were our servants.
Yeah. At that time.
Yeah. They were, and they would, some of them would want to learn English. And in our group, God, we had a guy that was a professor at San Diego State that was in there, and boy, he could learn that language like you wouldn't believe.
Interesting.
And so before we left the Chengdu area, or I did, my gosh, he could talk to those Chinese.
Really? Picked it
And
up pretty quickly?
we'd know what was going on. And, all I can remember is Ding Hao and Boo Hao.
What's that?
Ding Hao is good and Boo Hao is bad.
Well, how long were you in Shanghai before you went back to the States?
Oh, about 3 or 4 months.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to really enjoy everything Shanghai had
Oh
offered
my
then.
gosh, yes we did.
To the victor go the spoils, as they say.
Well, they were darn nice to us. Shanghai, well, I think the biggest building in there on that bund belonged to what is now Citigroup, Chase National Bank.
Okay.
It belonged to them, and boy, they had a nice bank building.
Interesting.
And there were a lot of beautiful structures in that bund. And one of the things, boy, we did get to meet the Chinese.
Yeah, I bet.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
They would invite you out to supper and things like that, and it couldn't have been nicer. A lot of them, well, they were European, and they'd gotten trapped there.
Interesting.
But they were lucky they were in Shanghai, because the Japs didn't mess them up.
When you finally went home, were you discharged immediately, or?
No, I had a lot of leave coming. I had 5 months of leave coming, so that's why I didn't get out till May.
Okay.
But I was home for Christmas in '45. About just barely made it.
Yeah.
Because I came back on a ship, troop ship, and it's a long ways from Shanghai to Frisco.
It took more than a couple of days, didn't it?
Well, I think it took probably 30 days.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And going overseas during the war, being in one of those convoys, that was 26, 27 days, something like that. And I'll tell you, it scared the hell out of you when you'd hear these explosions at night. And, oh God, yeah, people, me too, you panicked.
Yeah.
You got up on the deck of the ship so that you had your life vest, your toothbrush with you.
Well, what'd you end up doing after the war?
Well, our company was in the steel business, Patterson Steel Company.
Oh, okay.
It's now Valmont Industries.
Okay.
And I had some opportunities to go elsewhere, but my father let me know that this was a family company and that he expected the family to continue to run.
So you worked for the family business?
I worked for the Patterson Steel Company, and it's now Valmont Industries.
Okay.
But it was a very successful company, building or furnishing steel for a building. We're in a bridge business. That was big, and also we were a big user of reinforcing steel for paving roads. Or some people didn't use structural steel. They used concrete supports in their buildings. But our company, along with two companies down in Oklahoma City, agreed to buy so many tons of reinforcing steel from the old Sheffield Steel Company over in Sand Springs. Now, it's still in business, but what they did, they melted scrap. And the reinforcing is a different type of steel well, we ordered one, and I think we ordered a 30-foot, it would press up to 30 feet. And the guy that we gave the order to says, I've got a press brake here that's double press brake that can press 40 feet in length. And so he said, I'll give it to you for the same price because the company they were going to sell it to had gone out of business. So we got Crane Carriers business because they needed more than 20 feet, and they needed this 90,000-pound tensile steel. So one day, got a phone call from a contractor down in Dallas. He said, can you make a pole that would be set 27 feet, because we've got to put a substation in the middle of the road. There's an interstate, and the beginnings of the substation were already there. But he said they want these poles. They don't want any derrick structure. So we told them we could, and that's how we got in that pole business. And Valmont, all they do now is make poles.
No kidding. So did they buy your company?
They bought our company.
Got it.
And the guy that ran it was a Marine major, and he thought he was running the Marines.
You could tell he was a Marine major.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
what about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I lasted there 5 years.
Yeah.
And I left in '76.
Did you get married after the war?
Got married, yes, just a year after I got home. Met my wife at a wedding reception. She was pouring the punch. A nice looking lady, and all that. It was a Presbyterian wedding, and we were out at these people's home. And anyway, I knew her father used to be the scribe, or whatever you call it, for the Board of Elders.
Oh.
Took all the minutes and stuff like that. He was a court reporter.
Okay.
In the U.S. District Court.
Okay.
And so anyhow, he was very active down here at First Church because they needed him. Take minutes and do this and that. The guy, I can't tell you, you could just talk, he'd just be writing like. And he worked for Judge Savage. I don't know whether that name rings a bell. Well, he was a very prominent federal judge. Okay. The only one in town at that time.
Yeah, I'm kind of new to the area, so.
And his granddaughter was mayor of Tulsa, Susan Savage.
Oh, that's Savage. Now that I've heard of. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And well, anyway, are you a Presbyterian?
I just became one about a year ago in Sand Springs. First Presbyterian Church in Sand Springs.
Oh, in Sand Springs?
Yeah, I was raised Roman Catholic, and then I kind of got away from the church for a while, and my wife and I started going back to church again about a year ago. We've been going into the Sand Springs First Presbyterian Church out of Sand Springs.
Well, this was one of the dominant churches in the early days, because Tulsa was founded by this fellow Lockridge, a missionary, and that's where this name Camp Lockridge come from.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, this church first was the first church in Tulsa back in the 1880s or something in there.
Interesting, because the Presbyterian Church in Sand Springs was the first Christian community in the Sand Springs area. That was so the Presbyterian movement must have been pretty strong in this part of the state.
Well, it was.
Yeah,
it was. It's unfortunate, but it's town's gotten too big and people don't come in downtown anymore.
Yeah. Well, that might change with what they're doing downtown.
It could.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a few more questions, and I'll let you have your day back. When you think back on your time during the war, I mean, what sort of memories are the ones that are most prominent, that really stand out after all this time?
Well, I would say these experiences like where the Messerschmitt came through and killed 9 guys in the chow line.
Yeah.
And the other experiences where we lifted this guy out of the plane.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate that I wasn't in combat. I was where there was some of the action.
Yeah, definitely.
And I just feel very fortunate that I wasn't. I enlisted in the Air Force instead of being a draftee.
Yeah. I mean, what about? Do you think your experience during the war, the travels, the education, do you think it changed you significantly relative to the person you were before the war?
Well, when you got out of college, you were on your own, and you just had to realize if you were going to get someplace in this service, you had to really dig in and work, and not be one of these guys that work when he called on you. But in other words, and be innovative in what you were going to work with. And I found a lot of guys that, boy, you know, you had a good team. And I'll say that for our fighter group, that there was just a good group of people that wanted to make it work. I was really impressed with that, with the people that you met, or at least on the staff that you met with, were the kind of guys you could have a bull session and think about this, think about that. You just ran into a lot of good people. I did anyway. And I just felt that, well, being up there with Chenault and Bradley, this is a different Bradley,
Yeah.
but anyway, he was the assistant CO or commanding general of the 40. But they were sharp guys, and they were wanting to win. They wanted to do things right side up, and how can we do this better, and so forth and so on. You had a heck of a good esprit de corps, at least in the units that I was in.
Did you ever wonder, since you were plugged into the statistical side, the supply side, understanding, you know, the resources that were available to these fighting units, did you ever wonder how much more effective these units could have been if they could have been supplied more easily?
If they could have done what?
If they could have been supplied more easily?
Oh, well, you always tried to do that.
Well, no, what I mean is, because you had to fly so many supplies over the hump,
Yeah.
because you were limited relative to other theaters where they could just ship it in, did you ever sit there and wonder or get frustrated saying,
Well,
if
yes.
we just had a better way, an easier way to supply these guys?
Well, you knew that was the only way at the time.
Yeah.
And here was Stillwell down there, and boy, bless his heart, he wasn't thought of too well. But anyway, he was trying to make things happen down there and get the truck movement up into China, so you could corral these Japs. The Chinese, one thing, they were so busy feeding themselves that they didn't have time to go to war. And the country isn't as backward as India. That's the worst I've ever seen.
Really?
Oh, my. They had a caste system down there.
Still do.
And we had this guy that was take care of our tent. And I've forgotten what somebody in our tent asked him to do. He said, I don't do that. You have to get somebody else. And what do you mean? Well, that's beneath my caste.
Huh.
And stuff.
Pretty rigid.
Golly, boy, we about had a fight there.
I guess it's still a big part of Indian culture, even with all the modernization that's occurred.
Oh, and,
the caste system.
I heard